Welcome to the History Maps podcast. So, if we go back to the center of Florence during the early 1400s, we find this massive cathedral just sitting there stubbornly unfinished.
Right, the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore.
Yeah, and it had this gaping 45.5-meter wide hole in its roof, just completely exposed to the rain and the elements for decades.
And the reason for that is pretty simple, but also highly significant.
Right, the previous generation of builders had basically designed a structure that was so monumental and a dome so gigantic that absolutely no one in the world actually knew how to build it.
They engineered an impossible problem. They just hoped a future generation would somehow invent the solution.
Which is exactly what we are undertaking a comprehensive deep dive into today. We're looking at how that exact architectural problem catalyzed a complete revolution in the built environment. We are examining Renaissance architecture.
It is a movement that systematically dismantled the aesthetic and structural priorities of the Middle Ages. And we have a really robust collection of material for this deep dive. We are drawing from architectural treatises printed in the 15th and 16th centuries, historical analyses of the era's key builders, and structural breakdowns of the monuments themselves.
And the reason this matters to you, the listener, is that if you look around your own city today, like if you walk past a modern bank or a courthouse or maybe a university library.
You see those imposing symmetrical columns.
Exactly. You see the horizontal stone bands and those perfectly semicircular arches. You are looking at the direct physical legacy of what we are unpacking today.
We are going to trace exactly how architecture shifted from a physical blue-collar trade passed down through stonemason guilds into a highly theoretical intellectual science.
So to understand that shift, I think we have to establish a foundational premise for this discussion.
Yeah, we need to understand that buildings are not merely physical shelters designed to keep the rain out.
Right, they're readable texts.
Exactly, readable texts. When you examine a structure, you are reading a physical manifestation of the intellectual and cultural priorities of the era that produced it.
I mean, the architecture is the culture made visible.
Right. And if we look at the culture right before this shift, the late Middle Ages, the dominant architectural text was Gothic.
Which we need to quickly visualize.
Yeah.
Because Gothic architecture favored extreme vertical tension.
If you walk into a Gothic cathedral, everything is engineered to draw the eye upward.
You have pointed arches, complex ribbed vaults on the ceiling.
And flying buttresses on the exterior.
Right. And all of these structural elements are basically working in concert to facilitate spiritual aspiration. The entire logic of the building is about reaching toward the heavens.
They wanted to minimize solid walls and maximize vertical light.
But then the text changes.
It does. In Florence, Italy, around the early 1400s, we see this deliberate, highly conscious break from that Gothic verticality.
The builders stop trying to reach the sky.
Instead, they begin to emphasize human-scaled rationality. We see a profound shift toward horizontal alignment, towards symmetry, and the return of the smooth, semicircular arch.
Because this period marks the revival of classical antiquity. Architects began to actively study the ruins of ancient Rome.
They analyzed and revived the ancient Roman classical orders.
Right, specifically the Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, Tuscan, and Composite orders.
And these are codified mathematical systems of proportion and decoration. They govern the shape of columns, the capitals at the top of those columns, and the horizontal entablature that rests above them.
So let us establish exactly what that looks like in practice. Because when builders started using these classical orders again, they did not just scatter them randomly, right?
No, not at all. The material details how these orders were used to create a strict visual hierarchy on the facades of structures.
Particularly on the large urban palaces or palazzos built by wealthy merchants.
Yeah, you can read the facade of a Renaissance palazzo almost like a geological formation. It is organized into clear horizontal bands.
Starting at the bottom.
Right. The most robust, heavy order, the Doric, is typically placed on the ground floor. It has a thicker, sturdier proportion that visually projects strength and physical stability.
And then as you move up to the second story, the builders utilize the Ionic order.
Which is slightly more slender and features those scroll-like volutes at the top.
Yeah, and on the uppermost levels, you find the Corinthian order, which is the tallest and most slender.
And the most highly ornamented, often featuring intricate carvings of acanthus leaves.
So it creates a very logical visual progression, from heavy and secure at the bottom to light and decorative at the top.
And they reinforce that sense of stability through specific masonry techniques as well. A key technique was rustication.
Which is where the stone blocks on the ground level of a building are left heavy and rough-hewn right.
Exactly. They are rough and bulging outward with deep, pronounced joints between each block.
So it looks almost like a fortress at street level, which, given the political volatility and the street violence in Italian city-states at the time, was probably a very intentional psychological choice.
Oh, absolutely. It communicates impermeability. But as you progress up the subsequent stories of the facade, that heavy rustication grades into what is known as ashlar masonry.
Ashlar.
Right. Ashlar consists of finely cut, completely smooth-faced stone blocks with very fine joints.
Okay, so this graded masonry, from rugged at the street level to perfectly smooth at the roofline, combined with the hierarchical classical orders, establishes a profound sense of visual gravity and order.
It does.
But I do have to push back on the terminology here, though. We call this era a rebirth. But if they are strictly adhering to ancient Roman rules, like taking out their measuring tapes to copy the exact proportions of a Doric or Corinthian column, is it not just replication?
That is a common initial reading.
It just seems like they are tracing over ancient Roman blueprints.
Well, it was not an archaeological exercise in pure replication. They were adapting these ancient forms to serve entirely new typologies.
Right, because the Romans did not have banks.
Exactly. The Romans never envisioned a multi-story urban banking palazzo, nor did they design centralized Christian churches in this specific manner. The Renaissance builders were extracting a system.
So we should view the classical orders not as a rigid template they were forced to trace, but rather as a vocabulary.
Yes, a vocabulary.
It is as if they uncovered an ancient architectural alphabet. And instead of just copying old Roman text word for word, these architects used that alphabet to write entirely new contemporary sentences.
That is a highly accurate framework. The syntax was strictly classical, rooted in antiquity, but the application was entirely contemporary to the 15th century.
And they also freely integrated contemporary materials alongside these ancient forms, right?
Yeah, they continued to utilize stained glass and advanced mosaic techniques.
Okay, so to understand how this classical alphabet was put into practice, we need to look at the man who solved that impossible problem we discussed at the very beginning.
We have to look at Filippo Brunelleschi.
The figure who bridged the gap between medieval material constraints and the new classical mathematics.
Brunelleschi is the absolute catalyst for this shift. He was born in 1377, but he did not start his career as an architect.
Right. The builders of the previous generation were stonemasons,
Yeah.
but Brunelleschi trained in goldsmithing and metalwork.
And sculpture. He enrolled in the Silk Merchants Guild, which was the guild that oversaw goldsmiths in Florence.
And his entry into architecture actually stems from a bitter professional defeat.
It does. In 1401, the city of Florence held a highly publicized competition to design a new set of massive bronze doors for the Florence baptistry.
Which was like the commission of a lifetime.
Oh, it was. And Brunelleschi entered, pouring his technical skill into his bronze panel, but he lost the commission.
To a fierce rival named Lorenzo Ghiberti.
And that specific loss prompted a massive pivot in his career trajectory.
So following the defeat to Ghiberti, the sources say Brunelleschi reportedly left Florence and traveled down to Rome.
Accompanied by his friend, the sculptor Donatello.
Right. And they spent time actively studying and measuring the classical Roman ruins firsthand.
Brunelleschi essentially applied his technical precision from goldsmithing to the study of structural design.
And this intense period of study led to two monumental innovations. The first occurred around 1415 when Brunelleschi rediscovered the principles of linear perspective.
Because during the Middle Ages, the mathematical knowledge of how to accurately depict three-dimensional space on a flat, two-dimensional surface had essentially vanished.
Right. Medieval paintings often present a flat hierarchy of scale, where figures are sized based on their religious importance rather than their physical distance from the viewer.
But Brunelleschi realized that human vision follows strict geometric rules.
He observed that if you maintain a single fixed point of view, all parallel lines moving away from you will appear to converge at a single vanishing point on the horizon.
And to prove this, he designed a very specific historical experiment using the Florence baptistry.
Let's break down the setup for this experiment, because it is fascinating.
He painted a highly detailed, proportionally accurate image of the baptistry on a small wooden panel.
Okay, painting on a board.
Right. Then he drilled a small hole straight through the wood right at the vanishing point of the painting.
So he takes this painted board with a hole in it, and he stands in the piazza directly facing the actual physical baptistry building.
Yeah, he holds the unpainted back of the board up to his face and looks through the drilled hole at the real building.
And then with his other hand, he holds up a mirror in front of the painting.
Exactly. And by moving that mirror into his line of sight, the reflection of his meticulously painted baptistry would block the view of the real building.
So he could flick the mirror in and out of his vision, directly comparing his two-dimensional painted perspective with the three-dimensional physical reality of the building.
And they matched perfectly.
He proved that perspective is not just an artistic trick. It is cold, hard geometry.
All lines on a single plane converge. This discovery fundamentally bridged the gap between mathematics and art.
And for an architect, it is a revolutionary tool. I mean, you can now calculate exactly how a proportional space would appear to the human eye before a single stone was laid in the ground.
Which was the exact kind of mathematical confidence required for his second and most significant innovation, roofing the Florence Cathedral.
Right, we return to the massive hole in the roof.
Construction on the main body of Santa Maria del Fiore had started way back in 1296.
And they built the walls higher and wider, creating this massive octagonal drum. But they left the roof open.
Because the dimensions presented an engineering nightmare. When construction on the dome finally commenced in August 1420, the span they had to cover was 45.5 meters across,
And the final structure would need to stand 116 meters tall
weighing an estimated 39,000 metric tons.
and requiring over 4 million bricks.
To this day, it remains the largest masonry dome in the world.
And they face severe physical constraints. You cannot just pile bricks up in the air and hope they stay there. To build a dome or a large arch, builders traditionally relied on massive wooden frameworks, right?
Yeah, they used what is called centering.
Centering.
Centering is a temporary wooden structure built from the ground up. It acts as a physical mold. The stonemasons lay the bricks resting heavily on the wooden centering until the entire arch meets in the middle and the final keystone is dropped into place.
And once the masonry locks together, it becomes self-supporting, and the wooden centering is dismantled.
But the material highlights a critical logistical problem. The region of Tuscany was suffering from a severe shortage of usable timber.
So they just did not have the wood.
Because the span was so wide and the structure started so high off the ground, the sheer volume of wood required to build traditional centering for a dome this size simply did not exist in the region.
Furthermore, even if they had the wood, a wooden structure of that height would likely buckle under its own weight before they even started laying the 4 million bricks.
Traditional centering was a physical impossibility.
So Brunelleschi is tasked with building a massive curved stone roof out of thin air, with absolutely nothing holding it up from underneath during the construction process.
Exactly.
How does he keep the bricks from just falling straight down into the cathedral as the walls start curving inward toward the center?
He solved it through a combination of structural engineering and applied geometry. First, to address the sheer weight of the structure, he did not build one solid, thick dome.
He devised a double shell dome.
Right. There is an inner dome, which you see from inside the church, and a distinct outer dome, which protects the structure from the weather.
And between these two shells is a vast empty space, complete with a staircase.
By separating it into two thinner shells, he drastically reduced the overall dead weight of the masonry.
But reducing the weight does not solve gravity. I mean, as you build higher, the walls lean further inward.
And that is where the geometry of the masonry comes in. He utilized a specific technique referred to as construction by crests and sails, utilizing a herringbone brick pattern.
We need to explain exactly how that fights gravity, because if you lay bricks horizontally in a standard wall, and you tilt that wall inward, gravity simply pulls the horizontal rows down.
Exactly. But in a herringbone pattern, the bricks are not all laid horizontally. Brunelleschi directed the masons to insert vertical bricks at regular intervals intersecting the horizontal courses.
You think of it functioning like a zipper.
A zipper is a great way to put it. The vertical bricks lock the horizontal rows together.
Because the vertical bricks bite deeply into the mortar and anchor the horizontal rows, they prevent those horizontal courses from sliding inward and falling into the empty space.
The vertical bricks transfer the weight outward, channeling the force down into the massive octagonal drum below. The masonry literally wedged itself into place and became completely self-supporting as it rose row by row.
No internal wooden scaffolding was required.
None. But there is another major physical force you have to counter when building a dome: hoop stress.
Hoop stress is the outward pressure. 39,000 metric tons pushing down creates a massive lateral force.
Right. The base of the dome wants to bulge outward at the sides and crack completely open under the pressure.
The easiest way to visualize this is to think of a traditional wooden barrel. A barrel is made of vertical wooden staves.
And if you fill that barrel with liquid, the outward pressure wants to burst those staves apart.
So to prevent that, you wrap tight iron hoops around the outside of the barrel to hold the pressure in.
And Brunelleschi understood this principle perfectly. To counteract the outward thrust, he incorporated 4 massive stone chains and 1 wooden chain built directly into the structure.
These were continuous rings of material tightly locked together.
He essentially put the iron hoops on the barrel, but he completely concealed those horizontal rings inside the masonry, wedged in the empty space between the inner and outer shells.
It was a triumph of applied mechanics. And because the scale was so unprecedented, he even had to invent new hoisting machines to lift the tons of material hundreds of feet into the air.
Right. He designed complex machines powered by oxen on the ground level.
He utilized intricate reversible gears and pulleys so the oxen could walk in a continuous circle without having to be unyoked and turned around when they needed to lower the empty buckets back down.
The dome was structurally completed in 1436.
Brunelleschi proved that by applying strict mathematics, geometry, and engineering, a human intellect could conquer the physical constraints of the material world. He engineered the impossible.
He achieved the pinnacle of the physical trade. But the evolution of Renaissance architecture did not stop there. While Brunelleschi mastered the mechanics of building, the next generation sought to elevate architecture into a highly theoretical, philosophical realm.
They wanted to move architecture from a blue-collar trade where the builder is covered in stone dust and sweating on the scaffold into a prestigious intellectual pursuit.
And that transition required a completely different kind of mind. It required someone who viewed the world not through the lens of a craftsman, but through the lens of the law.
That transition is embodied by Leon Battista Alberti.
Born in 1402, Alberti was not a stonemason. He did not come up through the guilds. He was a highly educated humanist scholar.
And most importantly, he held a doctorate in canon law.
Right. He is the figure who completely redefines what the word architect actually means.
In 1452, he authored De Re Edificatoria, or On the Art of Building, in 10 books.
It was heavily circulated in manuscript form and was eventually printed in 1485, making it the first printed book on architecture in history.
And Alberti's treatise is foundational because he systematically separated the physical labor of the builder from the conceptual intellect of the creator.
Which is a massive conceptual shift. In the Middle Ages, the master builder was revered entirely for their hands-on practical experience.
The master builder was on the construction site, actively directing labor deeply involved with the physical stone.
But Alberti steps in and argues that the true work of the architect has absolutely nothing to do with lifting a hammer.
The material traces this separation directly back to Alberti's legal training. In the study of law, there is a fundamental distinction between 2 concepts: Indius positivum and Indius naturalis.
Right. Ius positivum refers to the actual written laws of a society, the flawed man-made rules.
And Indius naturalis, on the other hand, is the ideal, unseen, universal principle of perfect justice.
So the written law is the messy physical reality, and natural law is the divine concept.
Exactly. And a judge's role is to mediate between those 2 realms. A judge interprets the flawed written laws to try and reach that divine ideal of justice.
Alberti maps this exact legal framework directly onto architecture.
So the bricks, the mortar, the physical site that is the flawed Indius positivum.
And the mathematical geometry and classical proportions that is the divine Indius naturalis.
He positions the architect as the supreme mediator.
The architect is a figure who stands between the imperfect physical building materials and the unseen mathematical principles of universal beauty.
In this framework, the architect is elevated to the status of a semi-divine author. The intellect of the architect orders events in the physical world to articulate a divine sense of proportion.
And he introduces a very specific concept to define this universal proportion: consonitas.
Consonitas.
Alberti defined consonitas as the successful combination of number, measure, and form. He viewed it as the absolute and fundamental rule governing nature.
So for Alberti, beauty was not subjective. It was not a matter of personal taste.
No, beauty was a highly objective form of sympathy and consonance of the various parts within a whole body.
And he linked these architectural proportions directly to the mathematics of music.
He did. He connected visual proportions to oral proportions, drawing on ancient Pythagorean theories.
If you pluck a string on an instrument and then pluck another string that is exactly half the length or two-thirds the length, the resulting notes create a harmonious musical interval, like an octave or a perfect fifth.
Alberti argued that those exact mathematical ratios that create harmonious sounds should dictate the physical dimensions of a building.
So visual harmony must mimic oral harmony.
The ratio of a room's width to its height should correspond to a harmonious musical chord.
When this is achieved perfectly, Alberti stated that nothing may be added, taken away, or altered, but for the worse.
Think of it like tuning a guitar. If just one string is slightly out of tune, the tension is wrong, and the entire chord sounds harsh and unpleasant no matter how beautifully crafted the wooden body of the guitar might be.
Alberti is arguing that a physical room has to be mathematically tuned to these specific frequencies, or the space will just visually sound wrong to the human eye.
The theory is incredibly elegant on paper. But what is truly compelling is that modern technology has allowed us to test whether Alberti actually practiced what he preached in his manuscript.
Right. The material highlights a study conducted at the San Sebastiano Church, which Alberti designed in Mantua. Modern researchers brought in 3D laser scanners and topographic equipment to measure the physical building against his theoretical rules.
And the volumetric surveys confirmed a rigid adherence to his mathematical ratios. For example, the researchers found that the distance between the columns in the crypt is exactly 5 fathoms.
And the height of that same space is 8 1/3 fathoms.
And when you calculate that out, it translates exactly to a 3:5 ratio.
Right. And the data revealed that the relationship between the front facade and the main body of the church maintains a strict 1:2 ratio.
So the building is not just a structure, it is a physical manifestation of his theoretical formulas.
I do want to push back on the philosophy here for a second. I completely understand the intellectual appeal for a humanist scholar to link a room's dimensions to a musical chord. It sounds brilliant in a treatise.
Sure.
But does a space built exactly to a 3:5 ratio actually translate to a sense of physical comfort for a normal human being walking into the building?
You mean practically speaking?
Right. If I take an average citizen off the street who has never read Alberti and I put them in that crypt, are they really going to feel a profound sense of divine harmony? Or are they just going to see a square room with some stone columns? Is Constanitas an actual physical phenomenon, or is it just a placebo effect for intellectuals?
Well, Alberti would strongly argue that it is not a placebo, because Constanitas is the mathematical law governing the entire natural world from the orbits of the planets down to the proportions of the human body. Humans are innately biologically attuned to it.
So even if a layperson cannot mathematically articulate why a room feels perfectly balanced, their senses will subconsciously register that harmony.
Exactly. The visual arts, music, and human anatomy all share this underlying mathematical truth, making it universally resonant whether you possess a doctorate in canon law or not.
And this relentless pursuit of absolute mathematical perfection eventually reached its apex as the architectural movement shifted southward. We enter a period where the rules of classical architecture were fully mastered, spoken with total fluency, and then almost inevitably intentionally broken.
We are transitioning into the period known as the High Renaissance, which spans roughly from 1500 to 1525.
The epicenter of architectural innovation relocated from the merchant city of Florence to Rome.
And what caused that geographical shift was primarily papal patronage.
The popes.
Right. The popes in Rome possessed vast financial resources and were commissioning massive monumental building projects designed to project the absolute universal authority of the church.
The High Renaissance is characterized by sheer, monumental scale, absolute equilibrium, and a highly confident command of antiquity. They were no longer experimenting with the classical alphabet. They were writing epic poetry.
And the architect who best represents this era of mastery is Donato Bramante. His work perfectly encapsulates the shift toward confident, monumental clarity.
A key example detailed in the material is Bramante's Tempietto di San Pietro in Montorio, which was commissioned around 1503.
It is a relatively small, circular building set in a courtyard. The design was directly inspired by ancient Roman circular temples known as tholoi.
And Bramante meticulously applied the classical orders, specifically focusing on the Doric frieze.
For those trying to visualize this, the frieze is the horizontal band of decoration that sits just above the columns part of the entablature.
In ancient Roman architecture, the Doric frieze had a very specific codified rhythm. It featured alternating elements called metopes and triglyphs.
A triglyph is a rectangular block with 3 vertical grooves carved into it. and a metope is the square space between the triglyphs.
In antiquity, those metopes were often filled with carvings of pagan symbols such as ox skulls, which referenced animal sacrifices.
But Bramante perfectly replicated the exact mathematical proportions and the alternating rhythm of the triglyphs and metopes. But he adapted the vocabulary for his specific era and patron.
He playfully replaced the pagan ox skulls in the metopes with carvings of Christian liturgical instruments.
He took the ancient grammar and seamlessly inserted a contemporary Christian vocabulary.
Bramante's most significant undertaking, however, was his initial design in 1506 for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica.
This design represents the ultimate expression of high Renaissance geometry. Bramante proposed a centralized Greek cross plan for the largest church in Christendom.
A traditional basilica plan, which was common in the Middle Ages, is longitudinal. It features a long central nave that draws the congregation forward toward an altar at the far end.
A Greek cross plan, however, features 4 arms of equal length extending outward from a central square, creating absolute radial symmetry.
If the longitudinal plan had worked for centuries, why did the high Renaissance architects insist on this centralized symmetrical layout for such a vital religious structure?
It comes back to the philosophy of geometry. High Renaissance architects favored the centralized plan because radial symmetry symbolized the equality of sacred space.
A circle or a perfectly symmetrical cross has no clear beginning and no end.
It represents divine perfection, eternity, and the harmonious mathematical order of the universe. The architectural form itself serves as a profound theological statement.
When you study the high Renaissance, it feels like the moment a language is finally standardized. The grammar is perfect, everything is monumental, balanced, and profoundly clear.
But there is a trap in perfection.
Right, once a system is fully mastered, it can become rigid. The only way for the next generation of artists to innovate is to start bending the rules, playing with the syntax, and introducing tension.
And severe historical events provided the catalyst for that rupture. The illusion of perfect cultural and architectural stability was violently shattered by the sack of Rome in 1527.
This is a crucial turning point. Unpaid imperial troops mutinied, marched on Rome, and brutally looted the city for months.
The Pope was forced into hiding. The psychological trauma of the sack was profound.
It caused massive political instability, shattered the optimistic humanism of the early 16th century, and scattered patrons and artists across the Italian peninsula.
The resulting instability in the broader culture directly mirrored a profound shift in how architects approached their work.
We enter the period known as Mannerism, which spanned from the 1520s through the end of the 16th century.
The term derives from Giorgio Vasari's use of the word maniera, which translates to style or manner.
Mannerism explicitly rejected the harmonious, balanced, perfectly proportioned ideals of the High Renaissance.
Instead, it favored compositional tension, elongated proportions, and visual trickery. It is characterized by complexity, contradiction, and a deliberate sense of unease.
Mannerist architects still fully recognized the rules of the classical orders. They knew Alberti's proportions by heart.
But they began to intentionally break those rules to accommodate complexity and create a highly sophisticated form of visual drama.
Spaces became compressed. Structural elements were used in ways that defied basic logic.
Michelangelo, who is instrumental in the later stages of the High Renaissance, became a massive pioneer of Mannerism.
A perfect example is his work at the Laurentian Library in Florence. When you enter the vestibule of the Laurentian Library, you step into a relatively tall, compressed space.
But Michelangelo fills that tight space with massively oversized architectural elements. He takes paired structural columns, elements designed to project strength and hold up heavy roofs.
But instead of placing them out in the open to boldly support the structure, he sinks them deep into recesses carved into the walls.
It creates a feeling of intense confinement. And what he chooses to rest those massive columns upon is even more unsettling. He stood these heavy, load-bearing columns on twin console brackets.
A console bracket is typically a small, delicate, scroll-shaped piece of stone used to hold up a lightweight shelf or perhaps a small bust.
By taking a massive structural column and balancing it precariously on a delicate scrolling bracket, Michelangelo is employing a deliberately anti-architectural use of structural elements.
It creates pure visual drama and a distinct feeling of structural anxiety for the viewer. It looks as though the massive columns might slip off the delicate brackets at any moment.
He also utilized a technique known as the giant order when designing the facades at the Piazza del Campidoglio in Rome.
The giant order involves using massive pilasters, which are flat, column-like forms attached to a wall that stretch continuously from the very bottom of a building all the way to the top of a multi-story facade.
Which completely destroys the strict horizontal hierarchy Alberti had established.
Remember, Alberti wanted the Doric on the bottom, the Ionic in the middle, and the Corinthian on top? Michelangelo just runs one massive column through all the floors, completely overriding the division of the interior spaces.
Another architect, Giulio Romano, took this deliberate tension even further at his design for the Palazzo del Te in Mantua.
Romano's designs are deeply unsettling. He featured heavy fortress-like rustication on the facades, but he intentionally manipulated the geometry of the arches.
He designed the stonework so that some of the heavy keystones at the top of the arches protruded dramatically outward, making it appear as if they were slipping out of place and the building was actively collapsing.
He also utilized highly unconventional figurative supports. Instead of standard columns, he used caryatids, sculpted female figures serving as pillars, and herms, which are male busts, placed on tapering stone pillars.
It evoked a deep sense of mythological tension and physical instability. They were actively manipulating the weight of the stone to create psychological effects.
The best way to conceptualize mannerism is to look at a master painter. Imagine a painter who perfectly understands the science of color theory. They know exactly which colors complement each other to create harmony.
But they deliberately choose to take conflicting, intense, harsh hues and place them right next to each other on the canvas.
Mannerist painters actually did this, using jarring combinations of harsh greens and vivid pinks. They do it to create a sense of atmospheric fantasy and profound discomfort.
They recognize that sometimes perfect symmetry and absolute balance can feel visually static or even boring.
Mannerist architects were doing the exact same thing, but they were doing it with thousands of tons of stone. They were demonstrating to their highly educated patrons that they knew the rules of classical antiquity so thoroughly that they had earned the right to subvert them.
So mannerism introduces tension, anxiety, and distortion into the architectural language.
But while that was happening, another architect working in the 16th century found a way to synthesize the strict harmonious rules of the early Renaissance with a completely new residential typology.
This architect effectively codified the entire language and exported Italian classical architecture to the rest of the globe. We are looking at the career of Andrea Palladio.
Born in Padua in 1508, Palladio's background is notably different from the humanist scholar Alberti.
Palladio actually started his career as a stonemason and a stonecutter.
He came up through the physical trade. The material notes he became the first great professional architect who practiced absolutely no other art.
He was not a goldsmith, he was not a painter, and he was not a sculptor who occasionally designed buildings. He was exclusively focused on the mechanics and theory of building.
Palladio focused the bulk of his career on designing expansive villas and urban palaces in the Veneto region, which was the wealthy mainland territory controlled by the Republic of Venice.
His specific approach, which came to be known globally as the Palladian style, relied on a return to absolute symmetry and strict mathematical perspective.
He drew heavily on ancient Roman symmetrical planning for his residential designs. His decorative vocabulary was highly systematic, consistently utilizing very specific classical elements.
He frequently employed scallop shells, which served as a classical symbol of the goddess Venus. He integrated decorative masks based closely on ancient Greek and Roman theatrical art.
He also frequently utilized terms. To clarify, a term is a boundary marker. It features a carved head and upper torso placed on top of a plain tapering pillar, originally derived from the Roman god of boundaries, Terminus.
Palladio incorporated these specific classical motifs into a highly rational approach to domestic living spaces. His most famous and influential residential design is, without question, the Villa Rotonda, located near Vicenza.
It is an incredibly striking building. It does not look like a traditional house.
Well, Villa Rotonda is based on a perfectly square plan. In the exact center of that square sits a two-story domed rotunda.
Radiating outward from that central dome space are four elegantly proportioned rectangular rooms situated in the corners of the square.
And the exterior is where the strict symmetry is most apparent. All four exterior facades of the building feature absolutely identical porticos.
A portico is a porch leading to the entrance covered by a roof supported by columns. They look exactly like the fronts of ancient classical temples.
No matter which side of the house you approach from, you are greeted by an identical, perfectly proportioned temple front. It features heavy Greek and Roman influences, but the exteriors themselves are relatively plain.
The beauty of the building is governed by the strict rules of mathematical proportion and symmetrical balance, rather than by applying excessive surface ornamentation.
What truly solidified Palladio's enduring global legacy, however, was not just the physical villas he constructed in the Veneto, it was the text he authored.
In 1570, he published I Quattro Libri dell'Architettura, or the Four Books of Architecture.
This publication was a monumental achievement in architectural history. These texts contain highly detailed, systematic explanations of the 5 orders of architecture.
But crucially, they contained precise, measured plans and cross-sections of his own building designs. The timing of this publication was vital.
The proliferation of highly skilled engravers, combined with the wider reach of the printing press, allowed Palladio's highly detailed systematic style to be packaged and spread rapidly beyond the borders of Italy.
The material traces exactly how this spread occurred. For example, in France, architects like Nicolas and Dominique Bachelier relied directly on printed engravings by Sebastiano Serlio, another key architectural writer of the period, to design structures in the city of Toulouse.
The Bachelier's work in Toulouse demonstrated how the style could adapt to local conditions. Their designs featured polychrome interplay, which is the deliberate use of differing colors of materials combining local brick with stone.
They also integrated Mannerist ornaments like masks, diamond-shaped stones, and fluted columns.
It clearly demonstrates how easily distributed printed engravings allowed specific Italian motifs and mathematical proportions to be adopted and adapted to local building materials and regional tastes across Europe.
And Palladianism eventually became massively popular in Britain in the mid-17th century. There is a very specific, crucial detail regarding why Palladio's books were so effective compared to earlier treatises.
Palladio's printed floor plans included actual numerals. He provided the exact widths, lengths, and heights of every single room in his designs.
He provided the absolute most coherent, legible system of proportions in the entire Renaissance.
By prioritizing the practical construction-based aspects of building because he was a stonemason, while simultaneously providing a rigorous mathematical system of proportions, he made the classical language entirely reproducible.
He essentially open-sourced classical architecture. He democratized the blueprint. You no longer needed to be a humanist scholar, and you did not need to travel to Rome to physically measure the ruins yourself.
You just needed to be a wealthy landowner in England, purchase Palladio's book, and hand it to a local builder.
With those precise numerals, you could construct a perfectly proportioned classical villa anywhere in the world.
He successfully took the lofty theoretical frameworks established by Alberti, combined them with the monumental spatial harmony of the High Renaissance, and packaged them into a highly practical, globally exportable system.
So we need to synthesize this comprehensive deep dive. We have seen that Renaissance architecture was not just a superficial stylistic shift. It was not just builders deciding they preferred rounded arches over pointed ones.
It was a fundamental revolution in how humanity philosophically ordered its physical environment.
We tracked its evolution starting from the highly practical, unprecedented engineering triumphs of Filippo Brunelleschi, who utilized applied geometry to solve the physical problem of the massive dome.
We then examine the profound theoretical frameworks established by Leon Battista Alberti, who redefined the role of the architect from a manual laborer into an intellectual author.
We saw that language reached a state of strict monumental perfection in Rome, with Donato Bramante and the High Renaissance, before architects like Michelangelo deliberately subverted those very rules during Mannerism to create profound psychological tension and drama.
And finally, the entire complex architectural language was codified, measured, and exported globally through the printed treatises of Andrea Palladio.
The legacy of the material we examine today is not confined to textbooks or distant European cities. It is highly visible in your daily life.
Anytime you see a perfectly symmetrical facade on a bank, a semicircular arch over a doorway, or a domed civic building projecting authority, you are looking at it.
These specific principles, revived and codified over 500 years ago, remain the primary structural blueprint for projecting stability, rationality, and institutional power in the built environment today.
Before we wrap up, I want to pose a final question based on Alberti's revolutionary idea. We discussed how he deliberately separated the intellectual author, the mind of the architect, from the physical, dirty labor of building.
It raises a profound philosophical issue regarding the true nature of creation.
If the ultimate value of architecture lies purely in the mathematical conceptual model, in that divine state of consonitas and perfect proportion, rather than in the physical stones and mortar, does this mean the true building exists only in the mind of the architect?
And if that mathematical model is the only thing that is truly perfect, is the physical structure we walk through, subject to gravity and erosion, merely a flawed earthly shadow of that perfect geometric idea? A lingering thought for you to consider the next time you walk through the doors of a building and look up at the ceiling. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.